I want to extend a warm welcome to everyone to our third module of our scale building series. So today we have David Creelman, who's the CEO of Creelman Research, as well as Pauline James, who's the CEO and founder of Anchor HR Services, Inc., joining us today. And I know they have a lot of information to share with us today. So without further ado, I'm just going to pass the floor to them.
Great, really pleased to be here with you this morning and grateful you're carving out this time, and kudos to you for carving out this time for connection and learning. And David and I would both echo just the importance of having a great network over your career to explore ideas with, to learn together with, and to stay connected. Our discussion today, we're going to focus on and the topic is around people analytics. And we wanted to take a step back and talk about the foundational principles that we recommend when approaching data and people analytics, and specifically the importance of having an evidence-based mindset. What you can do right now to ensure you're more data savvy, is that will absolutely be a requirement going forward. And the importance of focusing on evidence-based practices and ignoring the hype. So we're going to spend some time talking about that as well. David, we have David with us for the first 45 minutes, so really want to make the most of tapping into his incredible amount of knowledge and research and thought leadership around people analytics and HR. And David, you talk about the importance of reframing the idea of being evidence-based as opposed to analytics-based with our approach and our thinking, and was hoping you could share some more insight into your thoughts.
Yeah, so the first thing that comes to mind is that, I coming from a science background, love the idea of analytics. And in some ways, there'd be nothing more fun than sitting all day in front of a screen of numbers and playing with numbers and graphs and all this kind of stuff. And you don't have to talk to anyone. But starting with the data is not the most effective way to do things in business, which sounds strange because, we say we want to make decisions based on data. But there are a couple of things that are important. One is that you don't think in terms of data, think in terms of evidence, and I'll explain that in a second. The other thing is you never start with the data, you always start with the business. What's the business issue? You don't just play around with numbers for the sake of playing around with numbers. So those are two most important points. And I'll just say something about the evidence versus data side, and then Pauline, maybe you can talk about starting with the business, is that there are all kinds of sources of evidence. So for example, if you're interested in, well, how do we reduce turnover? One thing you could do is you could crunch all the numbers from your HR data systems. Or you might say, you know what, there's a lot of academic research on this. Why am I not using the academic research as a form of evidence? You might also find that rather than sort of hard numbers that you find in your HR technology systems, you may get the best information just by talking to people. So you can gather evidence from interviews, from focus groups, from talking to experts. So there are all kinds of sources of evidence that are valid and useful other than just hard data. And you really narrow yourself impossibly if you just think all I ever want to do is look at the numbers that I happen to have captured in some data system.
David, I just wanted to share, you've got a great example of this where you were engaged for what you could have made into a very large, expensive project, but when you dug a little deeper and scratched the surface into the audience that they were intending to target, they were close by.
Yeah, well, so this one was really funny. So this was in Hong Kong, actually, at a law firm. And we were interested in women getting into the partner level, right? So they had a lot of senior, not a lot, but they had the senior women lawyers who, some of whom were, they would hope would become partners, and not as many women were making that jump as they would like. And so we were thinking what kind of analysis we could do. And there's a mathematical technique called survival analysis, which has to do with basically how many people go from state A to state B. And I'm sure, like, a lot of you are, are probably quite technical, right? You're interested in math, and you can imagine, oh, I'm going to look up this statistical technique, survival analysis, and find out how I apply it to the situation. And then you worry about, the quality of the data and what could go wrong with this statistical method. Anyway, you get super data nerdy all of a sudden. And I asked one very good question, which is kind of, give me some numbers. How many people are we talking about? And they said, oh, there are 7 women who we're concerned about. And I go, where are they? Well, they're just down that hallway. So we could have sat there with our big spreadsheets or other analytical tools, playing around with data. But a far better alternative was to walk down the hallway and ask those women, what would it take to make them stay? Why are they thinking of leaving? Why might they not accept a promotion to partner? And that's a great example of seeking the best available evidence, not just focusing on data.
And we see examples of that, large and
Pauline,
small.
maybe you should.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and Pauline, you should mention something about this whole idea of starting with the business issue as opposed to sitting down and just crunching through a bunch of numbers randomly.
Yeah, and there's so often we'll go in, and you're really committed and have been throughout my career to meeting the business, the individuals who support employees with where they're at. And and would love to emphasize how important it is that we dig deeper to understand the business, how it runs, where it makes its money, what are the friction points, and from an HR perspective, that we go deeper than sentimental analysis and engagement surveys to really understand the friction points of employees. Is it 2 extra steps to the scoop machine? Is it, the 3 turnarounds they do to move the product from the bin to, is it, the sales system that they're being required to use and how much extra process there is in there? That's really where the sweet spot that I see many HR practitioners miss of the value that we can provide. And if the support we're providing isn't tied directly into reducing friction points for the business and employee, it's not going to have the same value, regardless how we market it. Working with an organization recently where they had a firm come in and recommend a whole suite of HR programs that would look amazing in a textbook and looks fantastic. They don't have the resources for it and they don't have the budget for it. And it doesn't align with the priorities of the friction points. They have a rapidly growing client base right now. That's where the friction points are and where HR can add the most value. And as with most interventions, you'll find as well is they can be as big or as small as we choose to make them. And we really want, when we size our intervention, for it to match the actual gap and need. And happy to get into more specific scenarios and questions and towards the end of our discussion today, because it's often where the real value is.
By the way, Pauline, that's a very general point, but we're talking HR, but it could be any function you're in, is that you don't do marketing as a standalone thing. You do it based on what the business needs. And again, there with finance, you're always doing your finance work, trying to answer a business question. So it always starts with the sort of complex issues that are going on in the business. And when analytics was new, and it still tends to happen sometimes, is that they'll hire a data scientist and they'll say, oh, can you do some analytics? We're going to give you a computer and a little room to sit in and just do analytics. And that just doesn't work at all. What you have to do is you have to say, here are some business issues where I need to make a decision. Can you help me make a better decision by looking at the evidence and the data? Now, you give a data scientist or an MBA or anybody like, who's thoughtful, then they can tackle it. But you've got to start with a real issue that you're trying to tackle. You don't just do analytics off in a cloud someplace.
I think that ties to another important point, and would just even ask the audience to consider, when you're researching for a project, are you looking at what the best path forward will be? Or are we looking for evidence to support our own hypothesis, the hypothesis that we've already drawn? And how often that occurs in the workplace, right? We've looked at some preliminary data. We have our theory about what's going wrong, why something's not working out or going sideways, and we're gathering evidence to confirm our position, as opposed to going in and remaining really curious and objective. No, David, if you have additional thoughts on
By the
where
way,
we run into that.
by the way, that is such an important point, and this will happen to you a lot, both from your own heart and also from other people telling you things. Is that you'll have somebody come to you and they say, yeah, we want to do this training program, or we want to launch this new product. Can you give me some evidence showing that this is going to work? And that's completely, at that point, you're going to fail completely. I mean, when I say you're going to fail completely, maybe you can dig up some evidence and make your boss happy that you've justified this. But from a true point of view of making the best decision, if you're going in looking for evidence to support a decision that you already know you want to make, then you're not being evidence-based. And one of my favorite people in the evidence-based world is Denise Rousseau at Carnegie Mellon. And by the way, another top person is Gary Latham at a school called University of, what was it, Pauline? Toronto. So you've got Gary Latham right there. But they'll tell you that it's a fatal flaw if you go in just trying to prove a point, at which point you start cherry picking the data to prove your point. If you really want to be evidence-based, to say, I don't care what the answer is. I just want to make the best answer. And by the way, I have a specific, you all know the Gap, the clothing store, and this is quite some years ago before remote work was a commonplace, but the chief HR officer said we should allow people to work remotely for all these reasons. I think it's a good idea. The CEO said, Eric, I think it's a stupid idea. And you HR people are full of stupid ideas, and I think it's a terrible idea. And then the CEO said, but I don't know for sure. So let's gather the evidence. And all I want is the best decision. I don't care if you're right or I'm right. And I don't trust my intuition. I'm not going to make a gut call on this, even though I have a strong feeling about it, because I don't have evidence. So you go out and do some pilots, look at the academic research. When you're doing the pilots, gather evidence on turnover, engagement, retention, all those kinds of things. Then come back to me and we'll look at the evidence together and we'll decide if it's a good idea or not. And they did that. They decided it was a good idea. And the CS said, great, I can make the best decision now because it's based on evidence.
It's a great example. They moved to a results-only work environment. And we've seen the benefits of that play out during COVID. We also see lots of tension around some executives preferring to go back to the old mode of doing things despite the evidence collected over the past year. So we're going to go into an interesting cycle of being able to capture evidence and review turnover as well. So the key takeaways, what does it mean? Be data savvy, support your decisions with facts and figures, be evidence-based as opposed to data-based, replace analytics with being evidence-based. And that evidence is any form of evidence that's going to help you inform your decision. So that could be academic research, interviews with stakeholders, running pilots is tremendous within organizations, tapping into expert insight. And I think, David, we would qualify expert insight a little bit, and we'll talk more about that then when we said, don't buy into the hype, that we would suggest you're not looking for common practice. And lots of times you hear best practice, it's really common practice, and it's not always backed up by academic research. You want to assess the quality of the evidence you're relying on. And we suggest you start with a business question rather than starting with the data. And I would also further say you start with the business friction points as opposed to the HR gap that you see. Wait, we need to improve how we're positioning our EVP offer. Well, if there's no issue with attracting candidates, right, then that's not where I would focus energy. It's great to know the models that exist in a recommended perfect universe, but we absolutely want to start with where the business challenges are. David, would love for the audience to hear your advice on what they can do right now to be more evidence savvy and to be more data savvy. Being data savvy will be incredibly important.
Yeah, I mean, so there are a number of things. First of all, asking the right question is incredibly hard. It's very hard to go from sort of a general sense that something needs to be fixed to something really specific. So don't underestimate the amount of work involved in getting to what is really the right question. And the way you get there is that you talk to people basically, and you think about it, and you write things down, and you kind of circle in. And after a number of conversations, you finally think, you know what? What's really important here might be uh, the pay level of new IT people we're bringing in. We have all these issues around the IT talent, uh, but the one thing we really need to focus on right now, or figure out, is how the pay level of people coming in compares to the pay level of people who are already there. Uh, so just be aware of how important that process is. And it's really useful in talking to stakeholders, which, when we say stakeholders, your boss, the head of a business unit, uh, the various people in leadership positions who are directly affected by the issue, and ask them what really matters to them. That's how you get to the right question, which is going to lead you to know what kind of evidence you need to create. Or you not need to create, you need to dig up. And I'm not sure exactly how to say this, but first of all, these people don't necessarily know off the top of their head. Like you ask them what's most important. Sometimes they'll give you the answer just like that, but other times it takes a little bit of conversation. So don't always assume that leaders are completely clear about what's important. Another thing is that sometimes people will give the sort of the polite answer, or the which might be along the lines of, well, we really need to increase revenue, or we really need to control costs, or we really need to make progress with this new product. But sometimes if you can become just a little bit more personal, and you say, well, forget what the business needs. What do you personally most need? What's your top of priority list in the next couple of months? And sometimes when you get personal, you get a different lens on what's really driving the business. So it might be that they have a particular project that's going forward that they really need to deliver it according to some deadline. And that's really what they're anxious about. So they'll talk to you about these big MBA style business issues, or what's on the strategic plan, all these kinds of things. But if you really want to help them, you find out what's really bothering them. And Pauline has used the word friction points a number of times. So what's really bothering them personally in the short term? And then you can ask the question, you can figure out what the business question is, and then you can go and gather evidence that's going to be relevant to whatever it is that they need to do. So I really focus on this front end work of getting to the relevant question even before you start looking at numbers. And when you do look at numbers, if ever you see people looking at a report and you think, oh gosh, that person pulled out some interesting insight out of the report. Isn't it great how they could look at these hundreds of numbers and pull out an insight? The way they do that is they look at those numbers with a question in mind. So in finance, and I imagine all of you have studied some finance, but they might say, I know that I need to look at inventory levels. So I'm going to look at this ratio because it's something I'm worried about. So there may be hundreds of numbers on the page, but they're not sort of analyzing hundreds of numbers. They have a question: is inventory out of whack? Are accounts payable going up and getting out of control? How does the debt load here compare to last year? Are we paying it down like we said we would? And so they appear to be very data savvy and pulling out insights from the data, but they do that because before they even look at the data, they have a question in mind. They're looking for trends, they're looking for outliers, they're looking for something that they know is important to the business.
Building on that too, I think that emphasizes why it's so important to know the business so that you are using the business language as opposed to HR lingo as we're probing and gaining understanding. An example too where, and it took months to get to the answer of a problem that had been there for years, business I was supporting and when I was internal. And the long-term disability rates, the absent rates were excessive. It was putting the business in jeopardy as about what would stay in the Canadian market as opposed to be moved. And the vendor kept pitching every time they came in, well, it's because you don't have our early intervention system. And we would assess and connect with the employees day 1, day 2, day 3. So I'm not moving and in building up more services until we understand the root cause of what is happening here. And it took that, honestly, this, I guess, that perseverance, but questioning, we got the data. And then it also required implementing new fields as they weren't tracking everything we would even need to get to the insight that eventually we learned that over much more than 50%, like 60% of the attendance was driven by this one smaller area. And in a specific area within that had some unique challenges. And then we could get laser focused on an intervention. And the CEO was so happy to see from that. We just had data that we could just summarize and share where the pain points were, where the challenges were, where the real issue was that was putting the business in jeopardy and the employee engagement level in jeopardy, and take action. But I'll also note is the intervention, I'm happy to talk about this at the end, but the intervention was so simple. It was such a simple intervention, and we drove the attendance lower than it ever had been from the days the center had been open. But we wouldn't have been able to we could have just invested, you can imagine, we could have invested hundreds of thousands of more into this vendor that was selling a very expensive intervention that wasn't getting to the root cause. And related to that, David, is also when we interview leaders as well and employees, we're often hearing about the symptoms rather than the root cause as well, which is where we want to stay very curious and open-minded and driven to get to the root cause.
Yeah, and there's so many things that this brings to mind, Pauline, but for the audience here. So one thing is, I think in university, there's a tendency to value sophisticated solutions. Like, you know, you're getting all this education and you think, well, I'm getting all this education so I can do something sophisticated. But in fact, very often in business, the answers are simple. Like, you know, just like, you know, whatever it is, you know, it might just be solved by putting up a sign up going turn left instead of turning right. You know, there can be simple solutions. I mentioned in the pre-call a little bit about Peter Navin, who's a chief HR officer, and he was presenting data related to the what they needed to do to achieve their strategic plan in Europe. And the slide that the CEO liked best basically went along these lines. If we're going to sell 1,000 units, then we need, you know, 100 salespeople. You know, right now we have 80 salespeople, so we're going to need to hire 20 salespeople. Except we know that every year there's 10% turnover, so that's actually not 20; it's 20 plus the 8 we're going to lose. So we need to hire 28 salespeople. Right now, with my recruiting team, I can only hire 18. So we are not going to be able to hire enough salespeople to sell enough things to hit our sales targets. Hence, we had better hire more recruiters right now. The CEO said, I love that. And it's just high school math. It's just addition, percentages, multiplication. But the CEO loved it because it very clearly laid out what they needed to do. So don't be upset if the only answer you have is a very simple one. In fact, that's what the CEOs want. They want simplicity. And most of analytics, almost all of analytics is in fact just high school math. Percentages, trends, just sometimes just the raw numbers. And again, that's sort of one of the myths around being data savvy, is that it involves sophisticated math. It actually involves simple math, but very clear questions. Now, the other thing, we keep talking about understanding the business, and this is something that it took me a long time to learn. Maybe I'm still learning it, is that you don't learn it from a textbook. um, the way you learn about the business is you hang out with other people in the hallways and you just chat. Um, and there's a very famous Canadian businessman called Conrad Black, uh, who had a dubious sort of mixed ethical record, but that aside, uh, he did very well. He said he didn't, when he was in university, he didn't hang out in class. He would hang out in the bar with all the rich businessmen and politicians and so on. And by hanging out with that crowd, he came to understand what's really important, what was on their mind. He built the connections. And so, by the way, it's harder in a virtual world, so you have to work extra hard on it. But you always just want to be talking to people and building those relationships and asking them, what's really going on? What's really going on in the Vancouver office? We always hear this stuff. I'm not going to find the answer in a textbook. I'm going to find the answer by talking to people in Vancouver. And this is everybody. Sorry, this is everybody from the cleaner who may not even work for the company, or is probably contracted out. But you ask the cleaner, you go, gosh, what's going on here? And they may have an insight, or the head of the Vancouver office may have an insight. But it's unbelievable how important those kind of casual conversations with all kinds of people all the time are in in asking the right questions, so that you can then go out and do the kind of analytics that are going to make a difference.
It's building on this. I know I gained much of my learning by taking notes during meetings and taking notes when focus groups are run. And when we take on a new client, if I can carve out the time to facilitate any of the focus groups, I do so across levels of the organization. That really, honestly, is where I've gotten the depth to the business acumen that I've acquired over the year. So I appreciate David's point. It's not just about talking to the senior folks. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and Pauline and I right now are working on a project with the European Union, and there's something we're supposed to do which has to do with redefining the jobs in a world of AI and technology and so on. But as part of achieving that, we've arranged all these workshops, and the workshops are mainly them talking to us, not us talking to them. And so on the one hand, there's the official thing you're trying to do. Okay, so we've got this official task, we have to achieve the official task, but we set this up in a way that we have a chance to actually talk to the people and hear them talk to us, all people right across the organization. And so that's really how business works, and how you get successful, how you get things done. And again, it's something I think they don't tend to teach you in school. Somebody might say, oh, there's a more efficient way for you to get to the end result without having all these conversations with people. And we're saying, yeah, it may seem more efficient, but it's not going to be as effective, because we're not asking the right questions. I mean, we're not going to ask the right questions unless we get the information from talking to people. And let me just say one more thing. It's so funny that we should be talking about, oh, well, let's talk more about data analysis or data visualization and such. And Pauline and I keep coming back to this: talk to people, look for simple solutions, get to know what's really on the mind of the business, because that's where 90% of the real success happens. And sitting down with your spreadsheet or pulling reports off of some system is so small in comparison to this other stuff. And that's why we keep coming back to it.
And to build off your point too, and think it's so important, and this is a trap I see, and even when I'm interviewing or onboarding team members to work with organizations as well, we don't need to worry about sounding smart. We need to do smart, which is being practical. And just share, I had a client recently onboarded, and as they're talking to other CEOs, senior leaders we work with, that's what the feedback they got that was attractive to them, is that the solutions are going to be the right size and practical for their organization. But I would also emphasize, keeping things simple takes a lot of work, right? You got to be willing to really listen, really get into the details, understand the challenges with a really open mind to have a tailored solution that fits, that's sticky, that's going to be something that can be implemented and last.
And I'm going to, by the way, give you, just getting right into the data side. Okay, so we want you to do all this other stuff in terms of understanding the business and being evidence-based, but um, you will have data systems. You should carve out time to find out what is the data there. You should figure out, how do I pull reports out of this? If you have some visualization tools, you should take like Tableau or something like that. Take time to learn how to do it. So, and this is all stuff as students you'll be very good at, but you may have to carve out time to do it. And if you're the person who can do it, that can be very valuable. In terms of things like, how do you do useful like visualizations, like graphs that are really going to capture attention? You can potentially study that. There are books on it, but I think it's simply by paying attention to it. You'll see lots of graphs and data visualizations in your life and business. If you simply pay attention, you say, I want to learn how to do good visualizations. Look at the ones that you come across and pay attention. Was that one good? Was that one bad? Why was this one bad? What did they do that made me think it was bad? Why did I like this one so much? What was I know I really liked it, but what was it that made me really like it and think it was really useful? So to me, that's the best way to learn, is by paying attention as opposed to reading a book about the topic.
It's really important too, and remaining flexible. So look at communication, and pride ourselves on being very strong communicators. But I'll share that each organization I've gone into, I've had to learn how to write and communicate again to tailor for that audience, that culture. So there's basic principles that you'll learn. There'll be practices that are just work amazing within one organization, and you may be stuck on them too long in the next. But this works. I know it works. I know it works. Not every intervention, not every practice will work in every organization. So as we shift the clients or the organizations we're working within, we do need to adopt our style, our communication style, how we present data, how we present visualizations. So in that, having that great grounding, and then that flexibility as well. And I like this point too, that data doesn't change the fact that you need to have a relationship to be heard, right? And that no one will listen to you until they feel heard and heard deeply. This is honestly the crux of interventions, from influencing senior executives on why this program has a great ROI, to supporting employees at the front line with change management when we overhaul their processes. Humans have a basic need to feel understood in order to move forward.
And I'm going to tell you another story that relates to this. It's from the former chief HR officer of Marriott, the hotel chain. And he used to go and he said, here's something, a program I think we should run, and here's the reason I think we should run it. And sometimes the executive team would say, oh, you better come back with an ROI. Can you calculate an ROI? ROIs in HR are particularly hard to do because there are so many sort of assumptions. Things are hard to measure, right? And after he did this a few times, he started telling them, forget it. When you guys are saying, give me an ROI, what you're really saying is that you don't want to do it. So obviously I haven't understood what it is you care most about. Because if I come back with a spreadsheet, I know you guys are just going to shoot holes in it. And it finally comes back to, until he understands what the executive team really wants, he can come back with all the spreadsheets he wants. And as I say, they're just going to find ways to shoot holes in it. So that really reinforces Pauline's point.
David, while you're in line with us, and as someone who's known to have a tremendous amount of background around the intersection between HR technology and HR technology, your advice on how to remain current, and what also, I'm going to ask a double question, and as well, any advice you have for everyone on today as they're beginning their career?
Well, I mean, how to keep current. Basically, just keep reading, keep talking to peers. There's nothing like talking to peers, but to me, it's a combination of, in technology, I always want to be seeing vendor demos. Any chance I have to see a vendor demo. And I also want to be talking to people. One challenge that you may face is that you've got to balance the fact that you want to hear what the vendors are talking about the latest and greatest things, but you also have to realize that they're full of hype. If you're listening to consultants, they're full of hype. So you want to balance what you hear from vendors or what consultants are reading with with what you learn is really going on in the ground, and you get that by talking to peers. So again, this comes back to, we talked about networking at the beginning. And I remember an event I went at the UK where we basically asked people on a scale, where are you relative to average on analytics? And everybody said we're well below average. And you think that's mathematically not true. We can't have 100 people and have them all below average, given that in fact it was a fairly elite group of people. And they all felt they were below average because they kept hearing the hype from consultants and vendors about where they should be. So you've got to balance listening to the hype, and then, because it can show you where things are going, and then balancing the hype by talking to real people and find out what's really going on.
Thank you. And it just comes to mind, I attended yet another demo recently. It was promised this would be a new and innovative approach to performance management, performance enablement, aligned with research, and it wasn't, right? So we keep searching, but it really, to emphasize how important it is that we're grounding ourselves with evidence and great conversations with colleagues and peers. Not everyone was on at the very beginning, but do suggest, if you don't already have your LinkedIn profile set up, begin networking with students now. We've got people here going into different areas. And as David noted, that's really where many of us are able to develop our acumen, is by having relationships with people in different fields and different areas of the business at different levels. And a big part of my knowledge and development of my expertise over the years has been remaining in contact with people. And you learn so much more from what you're learning in your environment, what they're learning in theirs, and to be able to combine and share that knowledge is really powerful. David, any further advice? And David works with, and mentors.
Sorry, Pauline, and you're cutting out here, so I'm just going to jump in. One thing that I do want to say is that I'm sorry that I'm leaving before the question and answer. I always love having sort of the small group discussion, so my apologies for that. And maybe we can do I can imagine doing this someday where we do nothing but talk about just Q&A, 100% Q&A. Anyway, Pauline, thanks for inviting me to this. Thanks to the HR group for inviting me, and maybe we'll have a chance to reconnect again. So I'll leave you with Pauline for the final part of the session.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us, David.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Very good. And we did hear David's key advice, and he's quite sincere about being willing and open to continue a dialogue, which I know we would both welcome. So wanted to just to follow up on speaking to about not buying into the hype. What does it mean practically to be evidence-based? Doing what's best for your organization rather than leaning too heavily on where other organizations are doing. And I would argue that's where we've been stuck in HR, with some practices that have been long shown to be less than effective. We keep trying to iterate based on common and accepted practices, as opposed to really taking a step back and looking at the research and being willing to pilot. I think part of that is also being realistic about what success looks like. And this discussion recently, where if we're trying to take the pain points out of everything to perfection, it's not going to happen. Your engagement scores, right? People's satisfaction with growth and development. You want good scores, or scores you can aspire for, but perfection is unattainable. And this is where I think we can get lost sometimes, where we keep trying to iterate and improve in areas where they're really functioning quite well. It's not tied to the strategy organization. It's not going to have the biggest impact, and welcome some discussion around those elements that do tend to drive the biggest impact for the business and for the employee experience. Making sure we're implementing procedures that benefit the business as a whole, that are connected with the strategy. We do need to be fiscally responsible. And the point David had shared earlier, emphasized too, is that often what's important and what's useful isn't always necessarily the most glamorous solution. But if our goal is really to be focused on where we can have the largest impact and let that guide us, as opposed to what seems fantastical or what we've read in recent articles, we're going to find solutions that have a significant impact for the organization. And truly, that is just to assure you that projects where the fix may not be as exciting as what we had imagined, when we see the impact, like for example, right, Cher, we reduced attendance rates and concerns to the lowest level in the history of a unit. That's very rewarding, and the impact on the organization and individuals, it's phenomenal. So the key takeaways when we think about not buying into the hype, paying attention to the reality we see around us, being curious. So our intent is not to encourage any of us to be really skeptical. Skeptics can be, a bit abrasive at times. What we want to be is curious. You want to be open-minded. We want a questioning attitude, really open to learning, as opposed to trying to map templates, even templates that have worked really well for us in other organizations, to the situation in front of us. Being business-minded and thinking about the business holistically. You may have heard, and there's more articles around this, around how do we implement HR into the flow of work? But we think about how do we make sure what we're recommending isn't some paper-heavy, process-laden outside the business. Think of performance management, for example, for those of you who have worked in organizations or read about current practices. It's in this separate system. It's process heavy. Employees, leaders, there tends to be low satisfaction for most that participate. It's not seen as adding value. How do we embed? And with technology, this is becoming much easier, that we're able to now have more digital platforms where employees can input and update their records. We can make things much simpler to use, to leverage, and have it embedded within the flow of work as well. I want to pause there, and also the screens, connected, not necessarily by video. That's fine. Although if you're willing to come on and show your face as well, I'm happy to see new faces outside of the ones within my home and the small communities within which we have been small relegated during the pandemic, and would welcome the chance to have some questions and more of a conversation as well. And I can ask, when you think about how you would, the difference of the shift of how you would collect evidence, for example, in the workplace. Does anyone, and I'm great if you want to write questions or comments into chat, if you're willing to come off of mute to ask questions and have a conversation, just really welcome the chance. And also really open to speaking about HR more broadly and HR careers more broadly as well.
Yeah, so I wanted to say, I thought it was pretty important of you guys both pointing out that when we're looking into starting to tackle a problem, it's really important to ultimately first find what the root ideal problem or question is, right? I feel like personally right now I'm in second year, and we have a mix of second years, third years, fourth years here, and I feel like for me, who's still getting used to university and still first interacting with data and stuff, I feel like sometimes I'm looking at data, I'm like, oh my God, there's so much data. Where do I start, right? And I feel without this ideal question or target that I'm trying to solve, it's so difficult for me. And I think that it's really great that you pointed out that you've got to first find the root problem, or the friction point, like you mentioned many times, in order to be efficient, effective, and trying to find the best solution, not only for yourself, but for the business.
Great. Thank you for pulling on that theme. And you think of, I gave you an example, and thankfully I was later in my career. So I was able to probably require a bit more patience and be a bit more pushy and maybe a bit more confidence than I would have had early in my career. But I could look at the data and see something's not right here, and had enough experience at that point to know too, this isn't just about the intake process while people are ill. These numbers, there's something out of whack. And also trust that enough to go back and clarify. But also, the irony is it took the work to get in the back and forth to get clarity on where the real challenge was. And again, on the intervention side, it really was quite straightforward. And often the solutions are, we think what the biggest drivers for employees is, and the biggest way to reward employees is by including them, involving them, co-creating solutions, finding those things that slow them down to get their best work done. You think about the triple impact of that, right? As far as driving the strategy, driving business outcomes, and also improving the employee experience, as opposed to a focus on some very expensive rewards program, for example, where the maybe employees are happier for a period of time, but then they come to expect that level. Right. But we haven't actually driven the business as well, where what drives them the most is that connection. So you think of being able to, at the same time, include employees while we're resolving tension points, while we're identifying consumer challenges, the lift that provides over the company. And there's much better technology available to support continuous listening, to support better data trending around, another example, you think of putting out short pulse survey, basic example, after a big town hall, and seeing what employee input was, how engaged they were, and again, the more we can run mini surveys, for example, as opposed to great big long surveys that takes us forever to roll up the data and do anything, more real time and tapping into that data. But imagine also being able to see, the people that always rate our town halls and say that they're terrible and they stink are the same people who have low performance. So you know what? That's noise that we can ignore, right? Here's where we want to focus. So I find it very exciting also to think about the opportunities with technology to help us resolve a lot of the noise in the data, help us resolve inclinations towards bias in decisions as well. And just really excited about what each of you are going to be able to bring to the workplace. Question: how much has COVID affected your career, both negatively and positively, and how was it impacted? So this is a question to me directly. I'll note a couple things that at first things slowed down significantly, and also understand at this point I'm running a firm, and we partner with organizations to support them develop, implement their HR people strategy. And it's interesting, and I'm sure you've read a lot about, seeing this within your personal life too, just the range of experiences individuals have had, businesses have had. So we had some organizations that were shut down entirely and everything stopped, the work that we were doing. We had others where I was quite surprised that they were continuing, this is business as usual. Oh, you really want to move ahead with the change management support about rolling out financial dashboards and increasing financial acumen for your managers across the country? Okay. So absolutely a full range of experiences with our clients. And then for us internally, a lot of things absolutely stop. You think of training and the leadership development and facilitating meetings for a good 4 to 6 months. And then organizations sorted out, well, we can't just stop, right? We need to continue with our plan. We need to make sure we're moving forward on these key items. And then they were more open to doing things virtually, and we adopted. And in some cases, you see some benefits. You look at, David had mentioned the work that we're doing with the division of the EU. I'm not sure they would have reached out to, as well known as David is, but, primarily Canadian team. We have some representation from Europe as well, without COVID, because now traveling doesn't matter the same way to be there in person. But we're also seeing the advantages, for example, when we go into the breakout rooms and come back, you're not shuffling people between rooms. We can share things more easily on screens. There's just a number of advantages. And of course, there's disadvantages. And I think it'll be interesting over the next 6 months, a year, to come back together to see what stays, what should stay, and to be able to be much more present more options, I think, to companies. And often it's much more economical to do things virtually as well. So I'm happy, I welcome direct questions. So if I haven't answered your question precisely, please come right back at it. Other questions, comments?
So I remember on one of your slides, you had it in quotations. It said, "No one will listen to you until they feel heard," right? And analytics doesn't change that. So when you think, like when you say that making decisions and using evidence-based to make these decisions, if maybe there's people on a team that have differing views, would you say you would have to like present the data in a certain way for them to be satisfied, even though it's not like the best way to show it?
Yeah, so ideally, so it's a great question. You're going to run into this where you've got multiple people you need to pull together and get them on the same page. And you're going to be asked to do this at various levels over your career. And the topic may change, but the human dynamics and the need to feel like you're lining up with something and being heard are largely consistent. So depending on the audience, when it's small stakes and people are closer to alignment, often we can work that through collectively. We want to anchor with our ultimate goal here is. This is actually the key to helping teams resolve friction as well, and having a culture that has less friction, is organizing ourselves around our common goal. And in some cases, it can be just that we want to come out with a list of tasks that we agree on today that we're going to implement first. Like sometimes you start small with what you can build around a team. I've done interventions where I've gone into groups that are coming out of extremely intense conflict situations. And you just teach them how to identify, we just want to get through the day together. And make sure that we're working safely, right? But you hang on to what that common goal is, and that allows us to free ourselves up from our attachment to our individual perspective. So, and if we're looking at something more complicated, so you look at, was working with senior team, large organization, organizational restructure that would impact the various divisions and accountabilities. Very sensitive, right? And across borders. So lots of, you think of every layer of complexity around ownership and cultural. And in those cases, I meet with this key stakeholders early on individually. And I want to understand what their key goals are, what their key pain points are, what their key concerns are. I think in that case, I brought that together with a common perspective that I could present back to the room. Here's your points of commonality. Here's where we're going to have to work through, where we have some varying perspectives, and keep bringing it back to where we have alignment. And then in that workshop too, it's often, you don't think about it at senior levels at times, but I've found it to be applicable across levels of organizations, is getting them busy on assignments, even within a working session, that help them find solutions to work towards that common goal we've identified. But also want to emphasize, sometimes we're looking at milestones as opposed to going right to the prize, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. Thank you for your insight.
Question in the comments: do you think more companies are going to offer an increased mode of working for the future, like remote working and hybrid working? Absolutely. What I'm interested to see is how bumpy some of them make it for themselves. So we have some leaders who really miss being able to walk down the hall and interrupt their employees when something crosses their mind. And that may help them work very efficiently, but it tends not to help their team work efficiently as well. And I would argue, and have seen, the most effective cultures that are the most productive are really outcome focused as opposed to task focused. And leaders who are very focused on, I need to see someone to know if they're working, they haven't sorted out what they're measuring. They haven't sorted out the outcomes or the goals for the organization. So it's quite limiting. And I think what's interesting now with COVID is that employees will also have a chance and a likelihood to leave and go somewhere else. So that hopefully that will speed up the learning of what felt like it was taking far too long for organizations to catch on to. Welcome. And don't worry about it being clunky. And I know it's virtual. So sometimes you got to take yourself off mute and you're talking at the same time as somebody else. That's all okay. We'll figure it out.
Hi, I have a question, Pauline. So because you're running an HR consulting business, is there how you select or approach your clients? Is there like any certain industry that you would be like more tend to go forward and do the service for them more than the other?
Yeah, so two things to emphasize, and it's partly also where I'm at in my career, but also just a key principle of my organization is that I want to do work where I know I'm adding value, right? And they also see the value. So that's really what narrows it, that Venn diagram, less than industry. And we look at the sweet spot of where we can provide the most support. Often we're supporting transformational projects, change management, organizations that are growing and scaling. I've worked across a number of industries in my career, as have various members of my team. You always have to tailor the solution for the client. And I will share again that I think the reason we do get business across the swath, and I've had a successful career across different industries, is that I'm much more focused on understanding them than selling myself or our firm and its offer. So you show so much through the questions that you ask. And that's where just even, I mean, I'll share is the marketing folks who are on the call, I could probably use your help because our growth has almost entirely come through referrals. Or if I'm out at a dinner, I'm just a naturally very curious person. If I'm meeting somebody through whatever, whether they're installing something in my home or it's a cab ride, I'm really curious about, and for me, often it's about their work and what interests them. And you learn so much through that openness and curiosity. And clients can tell that because by the time they're finished a conversation, they feel like you really understand their business. And that's what's most appealing to them, that you're going to tailor something for what they actually need. So I'm not sure if that answered your question. I can list the industries that we're, primarily engaged within, but I'll say if we're really open and we don't make assumptions, that means the most. What does success look like for your company? Well, similarly, I see the value, they see the value. I've actually turned projects down or tried to redirect them when I don't think there's value. I mean, I could go in, you could charge for it, I guess, but that's not rewarding. And I don't think that supports a longer term relationship either, to do something where, at the end, the return isn't going to be there. And additionally, I would add that there's development for myself, for my team, that we feel challenged, and that we're developing a really strong relationship with our clients. Okay, the hardest part of your job. Are we thinking in HR specifically, what the hardest part of being in HR specifically is, or are you asking me more as head of a firm, entrepreneur? Yeah, I can answer within HR specifically. Great. Within HR specifically, it can be lonely at times, as far as you really want to put yourself and ensure you are set up to be an objective resource for the organization. And I think what has helped me in that role is that I have looked over my career to understand things more deeply from the business perspective and the employee perspective, and finding those friction points that solve for both. It really is a win-win. At the same time, there are times where you're involved in very difficult, challenging situations where you need to remain objective. And distance is probably the wrong word, but enough distance that you can be objective. I guess that's the challenge, that we may have leaders at any level of the organization that aren't managing things effectively, ethically. We may have a culture that's actually contributing to people behaving poorly, that we actually need to take accountability much further up the chain, as opposed to put pressure and turn people over lower down. So you think about setting yourself up to play that very objective evidence-based role in a warm and engaging way, ideally too, because people thrive on and need connection. So with that, it's where I also encourage you to get to know each other, to have a strong network outside your organization that you can draw on, both for guidance, support, and ear. And I also see that as a sign of strength. So throughout my career, when I've had the most senior roles, I've reached out to others for advice and had others reach out to me for advice too. We always want to challenge our perspective to make sure we're being as objective as we possibly can be. How has your company retained motivation within the workforce, especially during the pandemic? So answer that from two perspectives. One, from the clients we support, really encouraging them to embrace a more continuous listening strategy. If I can share, and what I've been talking a lot about and done some webinars on change management and the like and transformation as of late. And what I'm hoping we really take away from COVID is the fundamental principles around, more progressive change management. Organizations and many leaders have been over the top and thrilled about how their teams have adopted. Look at how quickly we moved our offer online within, a few weeks, and we had everyone remote and set up and moving forward within a couple of weeks. Can we always move this quickly? Is change management dead? There were some headlines similar to that as well. And my response would be, yeah, we can always move this quickly if we set the foundation of having a common shared context and a common understanding of the outcome we're looking for, and we're willing to delegate, trust, and iterate. So the reason we were able to move so quickly and companies were able to move so quickly and they were able to be so proud of their teams was because the pandemic, as unfortunate as that was, that gave a common context. Everyone was really clear, like, we need to get our offer online, right? Or we need to set up all these barricades so that customers and clients feel safe coming in, right? Everyone was really aligned that there was a swift need for change. They were aligned on what success looks like. There also wasn't, here's the irony, there wasn't time to invest in really complicated change management practices that were really top down with captains to support. It needed to involve everyone. There needed to be a high level of trust, and it needed to be iterative. And to me, those are the items that allow for swift change, a truly agile culture, more continuous listening, more trust, clarity on output, clarity on what we're measuring. We also couldn't, go by our false instincts around, oh, they're working hard because I can see them at their desk from morning till night, right? We had to much more rely on the outputs. So I hope that was helpful, but I'm happy to be redirected if I wasn't answering your question or if you want more specifics. Oh, and part of that was like with my team. What I'll note is we have always worked in a location that makes sense for our client. So we were already set up to be remote. We already had practices in place to support that as well. We have systems. We use Basecamp internally. We connect every Monday to share what we're working on in the week. We have projects set up. So even though we're remote, and so we want to onboard people too, we're a highly collaborative team in a virtual setting. So that likely helped us as well, because we've been, in some cases, further along than our clients were in adopting to working within an environment that is primarily remote. We're on site when we need to be and when it makes sense. And there are meetings that, we are missing out on too, where they tend to be better in person, but in large measure, we were already working within the way that we would recommend to our clients. Questions, comments? I welcome comments too. To HR more broadly, your career, the kinds of scenarios that make you nervous thinking about encountering in the workplace. What do you do if? Someone willing to come off mute or type in the chat? I can call on names. Would you recommend grad school for HR? I would say two things. If it relates to a specific area that you are pursuing, absolutely value. I did my master's in industrial relations. I also think I got the most value from my master's and enjoyed it the most because I'd gone back to school in between. And it gave me something to really hang that knowledge on and to really appreciate. So I think we can tell ourselves how much we should be appreciating the opportunity to be in school, and many of us do to a certain extent. But, you know, I went to being the one who was sitting at the front of the class, trying to take in every word, asking that question at 1 minute too, where everyone else is rolling their eyes like, can we just get out of here? Because I was so hungry for that knowledge and that environment again. So, you know, in that case, the workplace allowed me to have something to hang that knowledge against and pursuing it part-time. You may not need that break yourself, but what I think is important is that it's towards an area that you want to specialize in. What kinds of attitudes, behaviors, qualifications do you look for when hiring graduates, co-op students at your company? I look for a few things. Strong communication skills, writing skills are absolutely essential. So the more you can work on your writing to be concise, to be clear, and I'll share, this is sometimes a criticism I have within our field, is that the policies are sometimes overly detailed, overly cumbersome. There are times where risk mitigation is really important, but if we take it to the extreme, and many policies too, it's you would need a law degree, it feels like, to read them. If somebody at the front line can't read and apply something, then you're not gaining anything, right? So we really need to err on the side of something being understandable, easily applicable. So look for that commitment to tailoring to the audience, to being very open to learning, to being humble, to being able to work collaboratively in a team environment, and just a commitment around being evidence-based, I would say. Would you say HR and marketing go hand in hand with each other? Yes, but I would like to qualify that. I think often there is a mistake, and I think good marketing folks get this as well, but where I've seen within HR departments, and it's not always when they're rolled together, but it's sometimes when they're rolled together, where we approach employee communications the same as we would external communications, and more of a selling model. And this is one of the most common missteps I see within organizations. We work with them on transformation, is that we'll try to sell a change. This is good for you because this is going to be positive because. So if I can give you just my quick pro tip headline, avoid telling employees how to think or feel. They'll withdraw. They're going to be less likely to share what's top of mind for them. As soon as you start raving about the benefits of something, they're going to be more skeptical. They're much more interested in hearing the impact on them. So we want to move very quickly to, you may be concerned about the pace with which we're rolling this out. You may be concerned about what the training will look like. That's where we get credibility, as well as focusing on what's not changing. So I've just shared kind of the key top tips on communication during times of transformation, but you can see how that model differs from a typical, you can likely see how that varies from a typical marketing model. And I have seen arguably small changes blow up across organizations because they weren't well managed. And conversely, I've seen where something's been really challenging and difficult and we don't think employees are going to be okay with this. Think of COVID, right? We roll wage cuts and what have you. But when it's done in an authentic way where we're not sugarcoating things and trying to sell somebody something they don't buy, employees will take bad news a whole lot more easily than they will take bad news dressed up as good news. They think you're scamming them or you're at a touch or blatantly dishonest with too much spin. So I hope that answered the question, but I think there's, at the same time, there's a ton of principles within marketing that we need to apply. David mentioned his book, The CMO of Marketing, that we should look for a consistent experience for employees within the brand. How do you think HR will evolve in the next 10 years, especially with rapid technology playing a key factor? It's a great question. And I think we are going to look, and I hope that our offer looks quite different, that it's much more embedded within the organization, that we have much more of a consultative approach to the work that we are doing, that many of the things that take up a whole lot of our time around administration and the like are automated, that we have better data to measure our people, programs, and initiatives against. And we had a workshop, a conference we ran in January, we talked about HR, had someone come and speak about HR 3.0 and, had a conversation around how do we encourage HR folks as well to let go of some of the items that we've typically really identified with our trade and feel very reluctant to potentially move away from. And I think that's going to be a key challenge, of to shift our thinking likely from, in some cases, delivery and design, that we may have great tools that we're maybe configuring slightly for organization. And that's why I think this discussion is so important about how do we ensure that we're ready to be evidence savvy and data savvy, and that at the same time translate that to the human side, because the human need for connection is not going away. Our shared ethical responsibilities around protection of privacy and data will increase as well, which is where I think it's important that we understand the technology's capability and limits too. Wasn't there field outside of HR that you would have pursued if you didn't go into HR? I did do a stint in operations. I think that really helped me and my business acumen as well. It was incredibly humbling to go from giving advice to being on the shop floor as a leader and living up to that advice and being responsive to employees. And I think that I just can't emphasize how much that exposure is really helpful. And I've been offered at other times in my career to go back into operations, but I did find that I add the most value where I am at this point. But I've certainly always get close and always like to partner to really meaningfully help them move the needle on operations as well. How do you deliver negative feedback, get constructive to your workers when they did something wrong? Fantastic question. And my general advice and pro tip will be, most everyone will get defensive when they feel like they're invited to an autopsy. Just about everyone, as humans, we get excited when we're asked to help solve a problem or a challenge. So the biggest thing we can do is think about how we reframe the conversation, to depersonalize it, to talk about it as being a gap that we can solve together. So you think of an example where a situation where an employee you were to go in and present your great analysis and data to the chief financial officer, and they tore it apart, right? And you saw in the meeting the numbers weren't right, they weren't prepared, they were disorganized. And you think about coming back from that conversation and you think about, okay, let's put it in the middle of the table as a problem to be solved. I think we're both likely aligned that we didn't meet her expectations today. She was looking for this, and that, and we didn't have that ready to deliver. How do we solve for that? How do we make sure we're able to meet those expectations? So I'll also share, it's been my consistent experience with that approach that even when somebody really is a non-performer and not going to get there, they're more likely to put their hand up and say, you know what, this new role isn't where I'm strong. I want to go back to my other role, or here's where I see I can add the most value. When we start critiquing them and writing them up, then they go into defensive mode. So from both perspectives, even you play it out as being, this is someone you want to help develop and improve. When we take that approach, we get much more traction. And we also tend to get much more traction, I've seen repeatedly, even on the other side, where you allow the person with dignity to identify for themselves that that's not the skill set that they have. And it doesn't mean you're not compromising. I'm not suggesting that, again, that we're ignoring what the gap is. It's just how we approach it and how we discuss it that can make the difference. And also I'll just share with this group, that's my general frustration with how most performance management programs have not yet been evolved, despite the research. What advice would you give someone starting in HR? I hope all of you have your LinkedIn profile up. I hope you're all connecting with each other and that you are really remaining curious, right? So I will note that the job market was terrible when I first graduated. So I was in these admin roles and I would just read everything that I was photocopying, right? I would take a lot in during the notes. I would try to ask, maybe I'm not interrupting the meeting, but I'd see how many questions I could ask thereafter to get a better grasp. It was taking advantage of every opportunity and also sorting out where I can add value. So I learned, and it wasn't with, I can't say some intent, but hey, if I can share this, always sorting out, well, what's the value I can add within the role I have? And also not worrying. My goal has always been, how do I make myself irrelevant in every role that I've had? How do I train those around me or automate this or the like, so that you no longer need me to solve this particular problem? So with that, what I found is that the leaders have always appreciated where, or you write somebody and you say, I think we should, I think that we need to look at improving our engagement survey platform, or we should reframe this question, or I think we should be consulting the business around this. And when I make a recommendation, again, thinking a step ahead as far as, well, what would help us take a step further? So where it's appropriate, I would also craft the email, right? So when somebody comes to me, ideally they're getting one-stop shopping, and allows you to have more influence within your role as well. Sometimes your value is taking incredible notes and summarizing the theme. Sometimes your value is making a recommendation, and along with it, for my leader, if you buy in, here's the email that you could use as you follow up with your leader or with your stakeholder on this. As I've worked to reduce the need for my role, I have consistently been given larger roles over my career. So that would be my broad strokes advice.